Right. So, Mark, great to have you with me this afternoon, Mark, to talk about your book, Theorizing Future Conflict, War Out to 2049. I really enjoyed that. And just a little bit of an introduction to yourself for the listeners. So, I'm very glad to have Mark Lacy with me this afternoon, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. Mark's research focuses on the changing character of war and international politics in times of dramatic and accelerated pace of change in geopolitics, such as the return of great power conflict and competition, the emergence of new non-state actors, technology such as AI, drones, and robot critical infrastructures, and also the Anthropocene, which is something we've touched on quite a lot on hypervelocity, climate change, food security, cyborg bodies, and space security. This focus on the pace of change and what it means for the tactics, trends, and technologies of war and global conflict is explored in Mark's book, as I mentioned, Theorizing Future Conflict, and got some good questions lined up, and we'll see where we head from there, Mark. So thank you very much for appearing on the podcast this afternoon. Much appreciate that.
Well, thanks for inviting me, James. It's a really good list of speakers you've had so far, so I'm really pleased to contribute to it.
Cheers. So I'll get straight into this. So, Theorizing Future Conflict, really interesting book. Ranging over a wide span of time. And my first question would be, thinking further forward, upon the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 2049, what lessons do you think the People's Liberation Army will have learnt about warfare from today's current conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East?
Yeah, this is a really challenging question and possibly one of the most important questions of our time, trying to work out what the kind of wars that have been fought in the last couple of years, what they mean in terms of emerging trends in warfare and how China might be interpreting what's going on. And so, it's hard to know what they're thinking. But I think there's some perspectives from international relations theory that might help us begin to think about, how this could be understood. And I think on the one side of it, these wars might lead to a sense of caution. And there might be a sense that with every year that passes, we're going to see new technologies of defense that it will make it much harder for the invader and give new tools for the defender, whether it's drones, whether it's just the way the kind of defender can make it very difficult for a state like Russia or China. And it's this debate about what they call defensive dominance and how there are sometimes in the history of war and international politics where the defender has an advantage. And so that's been one of the sort of interpretations of the war so far, that this shows we're in this time of defensive dominance. And it's that question of, well, what would this war in Ukraine look like in 10 years' time, given the changes in robotics, drones, AI, and cyber, and so on? What would it look like by 2049? And what would an invasion of Taiwan look in 10 years from now, and 20 years, and so on? And is it just going to get harder for a state like China or Russia to invade Taiwan, invade Ukraine? Yeah, and one of the questions I've been talking with the students this term has been, if Putin knew how this was going to play out in Ukraine, would he still have invaded? And you get a lot of different positions on this. Some people say, well, he knew exactly how this would play out and the messiness that would unfold. And some people say, well, no, he probably would have kind of paused and done things differently. And I think there's a sense that we like to think as academics and as citizens, really, that leaders learn from their mistakes. So we like to think, well, the Chinese will look at what's happened in Ukraine and think, actually, we don't want to go down this path. Mm-hmm. But here, I'd probably become a realist and say that the tragedy of international politics is that leaders never learn. And this is the tragedy of great power politics, as someone like John Mearsheimer might put it. So the tragedy is that we repeat the same kinds of mistakes again and again. And I think at the same time, there's this question about what we might call the liberal way of war and how it might be different from the authoritarian way of war, the kind of war that is waged by Russia or possibly China. And there's the book by Samuel Moyn, which is really worth reading, called Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, where he's basically making the point about the liberal way of war, that one of the dangers in liberal democracies is that they have this sense of hubris, of exceptionalism, of almost messianic desire to transform and improve the world. And this often leads to more chaos around the world, even though the big project for liberal states is what he calls humane war, or what James Derderian referred to as virtuous war. And so there is this argument that maybe what America has learned since going back to Vietnam is that it needs to stop waging the kinds of wars it's fought since Vietnam. And maybe that plays into debates that you see right now, the kinds of debates that you see with Trump and how America needs to engage with the world differently, for example. And so there is this position that maybe America is really starting to rethink its kind of approach to foreign policy, basically. And the counter to that is that maybe it's just on a break until the next Iraq, the next Afghanistan. And so I think in some ways the question is, has China watched and kind of learned from the American experience of wars going back to Vietnam? And might it do things differently, basically? And if you, in the book, I talk about the debate about unrestricted warfare and this idea that China is going to approach the 21st century very differently than America approached the 20th century, and it's going to use very different types of tactics. The kind of debate about the gray zone, hybrid war, unrestricted warfare, that it's not going to do things in the same way that the Americans did since Vietnam. There's not going to be a Chinese attempt at regime change or kind of trying to transform the international order in the way the Americans did. But at the same time, the realist might come along and say, well, the temptation to show military power and force is an inescapable part of being a great power. So even though China might talk about doing things differently, unrestricted warfare, it's still going to kind of perform its role as a superpower, great power, as it becomes more powerful out to 2049 in military terms. And so I think this is one of the most important questions of our time, really. It's, how does China engage with becoming a superpower, and how does America engage with the fact that it's going to see this new military power on the block, so to speak?
And that just made me think about that classic phrase, the generals are always preparing for the last war.
Yeah.
And obviously we've seen Russia engaged in a conflict where there's drone and grey warfare, as you mentioned, and China and America sort of aren't engaged in such conflicts at the moment. But by the time if they do get involved in such conflicts, what will they look like? And it brought me back to the question of Is Bakhmut the 21st century's Guernica, with drones representing a revolution in military affairs, without which a combatant has no hope of winning?
Yeah, I mean, this question makes me think about the work of Paul Virilio in particular, and how I wish Paul Virilio was still alive, to help us make sense of the types of event we've seen in the last couple of years. Because Virilio, his work was kind of filled with discussions of art and politics, and art and warfare, basically, and warfare and cinema. And I guess, thinking through this idea about Guernica, Picasso was trying to depict an event that wasn't going to be filmed and circulated in the type of granular detail that we see now in how we perceive wars, on social media and Twitter, X, and so on, where we're just seeing war from really intimate, granular detail. At the time when Picasso was working, we didn't have that experience of what war was like and how it was changing. And so I think there's a big question about what type of art will be important, given the kind of granular detail through which we come to kind of experience war in the 21st century. And I think on one level, the important work might be in the films, in the kind of Netflix television shows, in the novels that explain this kind of changing character of war from a plurality of perspectives. You get used to seeing so much on social media that is quite shocking. Well, it's very shocking, and quite horrific. And you kind of get used to seeing those images and getting used to the fact that we're often in this state of confusion about what to believe, what's fake, what's real. And I think it's partly going to be about the kind of stories that we come to hear about the wars that are being fought in the 21st century, rather than the images that we're kind of overloaded with. And I always think of some of the stories that I've heard about the war in Ukraine, because my sister-in-law is Ukrainian and she lives in the UK. And so I hear a lot of stories through her about what's been going on with her family. And for example, she told me this story about her aunt who lived in Mariupol. And one evening she was in a dressing gown and there were alarms, and she went out of her apartment and ended up in the underground, in the sort of underground rail station. And she's in her dressing gown, and she didn't come out for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, she was underground while the bombing of Mariupol was unfolding. And then I think what happened is she came out of the underground and was basically put on a bus to a town in Russia where I think she'd been born, because of the kind of mixed nature of Ukrainian society. And I think it's going to be those stories, as they're kind of explained through television shows that go into detail, through films, through novels, rather than an artwork like Guernica, which I think was trying to kind of explain this new type of warfare that was emerging. But I think on this question of drones and their impact, I think we need to be a bit cautious about overstating the significance of how drones have been used. I think, it's going to take time to really work out their significance, because I think on one level, the way drones have shaped the conflict kind of emerged from the fact that there are various limits placed on what can be done. Yeah, so the Ukrainians, I guess in an ideal world, would want access to weaponry that the West and NATO isn't going to allow them to have. And at the same time, Russia has got limits. Yeah, people are trying to work out what the threshold is and not go above that threshold and escalate the conflict and the war in a kind of really dangerous way. And so I think drones are almost like the sub-threshold terrain of the conflict. Yeah. And I was just reading before I started talking to you about the Ukrainian intelligence operation. I think it's called the SBU, and how powerful and significant this intelligence operation or organization has been in kind of developing a whole range of tactics, the assassination of key military figures in Russia, on Russian territory, and a whole variety of hybrid war tactics. So I think that, there's a whole range of elements to this conflict. And I think in the book, I talk about this idea of mosaic war, that in the 21st century, and this is an idea from America, that warfare will be a kind of mosaic where you combine different elements to create the effect you want. And I think drones are just one element of the mosaic. And we don't know all the elements that are playing out. But I think there's a variety of often invisible aspects to this war that we're just not seeing, and we don't really fully kind of grasp yet. I mean, it could be things like, attacks on underwater cables being an element of this war. It could be the cyber dimension that we're not so aware of. I mean, I think there's so many elements in this mosaic, and I think the drone aspect is just one element. It's the most visible element. And I think, obviously, how drones unfold in the coming decades is going to be really kind of interesting and troubling. The change in size and the change in capability, it's going to be a key aspect of conflict. But at the same time, I think whoever is looking at this war and trying to work out what it means for the future will be thinking, okay, how do we counter, if a smaller state posed a big problem for a bigger state like Russia in military terms, how do we regain the advantage? And so I think whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whoever, they'll be thinking, how do we learn from this kind of experience of how drones can be used to really create a massive problem for us? And they're going to just get cheaper, they're going to get more powerful, and they're probably going to, take forms that we're currently not imagining. And so I think that will be a key part of the conflict. But in terms of this question about, drones being the kind of military technology that is creating this kind of stalemate, I think we need to be a bit careful of overstating that, because I think there's so many other forces that come into play, basically.
I mean, that's a good point. I suppose what I was thinking about with the Bakhmut Guernica comparison was the way in which I might be wrong here, but that Guernica was the first mass bombing of civilian targets, and Picasso captured that. And obviously, into World War II, then aerial bombardment became this obviously huge and overwhelmingly important thing. Whereas perhaps drone warfare won't become the overriding factor. Because, as you say, it kind of plays this sort of middle role, perhaps in assassinations and degradation of infrastructure, etc.
Yeah. No, I think it's one important element, but I think, as time goes on and we find out more about the kind of way this war has been waged, I think we might be asking different questions. But, and there are other examples of how drones are being used across the world right now. But I think it's the next war on this scale might involve completely different technologies and tactics.
Because there are those that advocate, okay, the next time the United States has its defense spending round, they shouldn't bother building any more aircraft carriers. They should just build a huge drone fleet.
Yeah.
That would seem to be more of a provocation rather than, an intellectual provocation rather than a real suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it was Elon Musk kind of kicking off this debate this week about military spending and the fact that America could be spending a ridiculous sum of money on various technologies that were going to be redundant in this new age of drone warfare and AI. And I think, obviously there is an important point being made, but I think we also have to think that the pace of change in technology might mean that, what looks like the future of war might actually be a source of vulnerability, or it might be overtaken by other kind of technologies and tactics.
Thank you, Mark. Just moving on a little bit, we're still staying with drones. And again, what I really like about your book, Mark, is the level of theory that's apparently, this is something that I'm trying to do with hypervelocity and go to that theoretical level. And I love the kind of the terms that are used, and maybe these could be unpacked a little bit for listeners. So my next question would be, in what way do drones manifest the protopian and necropolitical aspects of the liberal way of war?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think one of the things I was trying to do in the book is kind of create new terms or kind of use concepts that people might not be familiar with in the war studies literature. And the protopian is a good example of that. And really, it comes from Kevin Kelly, who's a futurist. I think he created Wired magazine back in the 80s, and he writes about technology. And in his book, The Inevitable, he talks about protopia and the idea that, basically technology is improving and we're not going to have some utopia. It's going to be this constant process of kind of improvement, accident or failure, then a next wave of improvement. But basically it's an upward path. And so, what I'm saying in the book is that's basically a kind of another way of talking about the liberal view of history as progress. And my argument is that, in terms of modernity in the modern world, there's these two kind of faces to it. There's the kind of protopian, liberal, techno-optimist view. Then there is this kind of darker view, which goes back through to the Frankfurt School, for example, and Adorno and Horkheimer, through to people like Virilio, and now to people like Mbembe and his idea of necropolitics. So the idea that, for all our kind of enthusiasm and hope about the powers of technology, the kind of dark side view is that, we find new ways of controlling, of killing, of hunting. And, when you think about the future of war, you've got to think about the fact that, some things in modernity become improved and more humane, but at the same time, new dark possibilities are created. And I think in the academic debates, there are points where you can be a kind of protopian liberal optimist and not have any time for this kind of more critical view, and vice versa. And what I try and do is say that both of these trends exist together and often shape one another. And so I think the point I'm trying to make is that modernity does improve some aspects of the human condition, and I wouldn't want to kind of disregard all the positive aspects. And I guess I often ask students which technology has or technologies have transformed the human condition most in modernity. And of course, there's many examples, but I like to kind of get them to think about things that they might not consider in thinking about security. So, for example, painkillers. Yeah, that, all right, we can be very critical of the modern world, but, let's not forget how important things we take for kind of granted on an everyday level, like painkillers, are in terms of how that improves the human condition, and a whole range of medical kind of technologies that transform the human body in incredible ways and will continue to do so. That the medical advances of modernity should not be kind of taken for granted. But at the same time, and so, being 90 in the middle of the 21st century could be quite amazing compared to being 90 at any other moment in history, if we're still around in 2049. But at the same time, there will be the kind of darker necropolitical sides to advances in medical technology, or the kind of debates about cloning and genetic engineering, the kind of David Cronenberg kind of dystopian science fiction view of technology. But, in the book, I'm trying to say, we need to consider both possibilities at the same time, and they might coexist at the same time. And so for all the faith in technical fixes, whether it's about health or through to geoengineering in relation to climate change, there is a kind of necropolitical dark side to the world. And I think one of the big questions for the 21st century is whether the protopian world of technical fixes that will aim to produce resilience and heal the planet will keep life on Earth from avoiding the more apocalyptic scenarios, the kind of situations that might require more necropolitical strategies of national security. So, whether it's a world of kind of climate emergencies and climate refugees where the security state is employing lots of very unpleasant necropolitical strategies, kind of world envisaged in films like Elysium from a couple of years back, or there's going to be a more kind of protopian world of technical fixes. But I think regarding drones, robots, and AI, and this debate about protopia and necropolitics, I think the point I tried to make in the book is this, that all these innovations or revolutions that we're going to see in the coming years will hold both protopian and necropolitical possibilities, but drones and robots could be incredible in the way they become our companions. So from this kind of protopian view, they could improve so much of the human condition. And I was thinking of a conversation I had in the summer. I was in India and I was in Kolkata, and I was talking to someone who worked for an NGO which was working on loneliness, basically, with older people in that city, because lots of the younger people were leaving Kolkata to move to cities that were seen as more economically dynamic. There were more jobs, basically. And so you had a lot of older people who were very lonely. And so this NGO was trying to explore ways of dealing with loneliness. And I think that is, a very kind of, it's going to be an increasingly important part or problem for people around the planet. It already is. Yeah? And you can see from this kind of optimistic protopian view, the way that maybe by the middle of the 21st century, or towards the end of the century, we're going to have robot companions that are really going to be improving what it means to be a human in a kind of more lonely world, where people have migrated or people have died. And, there's a chance, by the time we make it to 90, a robot might be our closest friend. And I don't think we should discount the kind of optimistic uses of robots and drones. And so I try again to show that, it's not all necropolitics, basically. It's not all kind of killer drones and so on. But there are obviously serious necropolitical possibilities. And I guess the necropolitical possibilities will be shaped by the type of social, political, and economic contexts in which these technologies emerge. And I guess in terms of AI and drones, on one level, it's the problem of AI that might develop its own desires and strategies. The debate about kind of, super intelligence and general AI developing its own agendas, or just more kind of sort of narrow AI, kind of generative AI, the type of AI that's used now, just being used in a way in all aspects of life that generate mistakes. And obviously, these mistakes will be more terrifying if it's in a military context. And the way AI might be used to select targets, for example. And I guess my big concern, and this is one of the things I talk to students about all the time, because we have a big problem with students using AI tools to write their essays, and it comes up as sort of AI plagiarism. And one of the ways that we often see cases of AI plagiarism is that you'll read an essay and it's clear that a publication that's being cited doesn't exist. And I think one of the cases we had in Lancaster was a member of staff seeing a reference to something they never wrote. So, and I guess that's the debate about AI hallucinating and so on.
Yes.
And so I think it's that issue of, or that kind of concern about to what extent AI is being used in all aspects of life, but it's something that we currently cannot really trust. And yet we might be using it for more significant kind of tasks, basically. So that's one side of it, is kind of like the accidents that occur from how AI is being used when it doesn't actually work in the way that people think it works, and through to this idea that we're potentially creating the source of our own destruction, the kind of Terminator type scenario. But I think the point I try to make is that the horror of AI might be also in the way it's used as a bureaucratic tool that will also have implications for warfare in the way that targets are selected. And I think the point I make in the book, and I certainly make in my teaching, because I often use Zygmunt Bauman's book, Modernity and the Holocaust. And I think if Bauman was alive today, in the conclusion to that book, he would be talking about AI tools as the latest stage in the kind of dehumanization, in the bureaucracy that he's outlining so powerfully in that book. And, I think, and I certainly make this point in something I published earlier in the year, in the 50th anniversary issue of Review of International Studies. On the next 50 years of international politics, where I basically make the point that, all right, so we talk about AI and the Terminator and these kind of really apocalyptic scenarios, but what is equally troubling to me is what we see in the post office scandal in the UK, and a film I watched at the beginning of the year that made a real impact on me, on Mr. Bates and the post office. And this is kind of like the banality of how technologies can be used by organizations. And I think that is going to be possibly as troubling as the more militaristic uses of this technology, as it's going to unfold so and develop so dramatically in the years ahead. It's kind of going to be those more banal uses. And I think in the book, I have a section in the chapter on AI called The Banality of AI, where it's kind of referring back to Hannah Arendt's ideas about bureaucracy and the banality of evil. And so I think it's going to be those more banal uses that might be as troubling as the more apocalyptic.
No, that's really chilling. That hadn't occurred to me. Yeah, sort of Kafka with AI. That would be even worse than being lost within a labyrinth of human beings. But then, obviously, even more chilling, the idea of AI administered genocide and that kind of targeting of individuals along that way. But as you were talking there, you mentioned Virilio and accidents that happen, and obviously Virilio's a name that comes a lot on hypervelocity. And it also made me think of one of my favourite authors on drones, Gregoire Chamayou, the French theorist. And he talks a lot about, I'm not quite sure whether he uses the term necropolitical, he probably does actually, but in the liberal way of war, that drones actually increase the likelihood of war because it reduces the skin in the game for the state. Basically, if you don't have physical soldiers and that are obviously going to be put in harm's way and possibly killed, and this creates sort of a backlash in society, there's no kind of hold on you waging wars willy-nilly, really, because there's no human impact on the liberal state, let's say, on the Western states, and so get away with impunity.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I think there's a kind of a sort of broader issue beyond technology in terms of how the liberal way of war is changing, which might be seen in what's happening in Ukraine, where it's that what military professionals will do from this country and from the United States is be training other people to fight wars and be giving assistance, whether it's about how to use the technology or just, how to fight. But the role will be as kind of trainers and educators of people fighting wars, because the liberal way of war has reached a point where we're not going to repeat what happened after 9/11 and the 20 years or more fighting the war on terror. We're going to kind of, retreat from those kinds of conflicts. And what we're going to see is either training of other people's soldiers or very kind of granular, targeted special forces operations involving small groups. But we're never going to return to those kind of epic, big wars that have been fought for the last, 20 years.
And that's a good point to think forward, I think, Mark, because again, what's really good about Theorizing Future Conflict is towards the end of the book, you sort of give these various different scenarios, some more protopian, some more necropolitical.
Yeah.
And one in particular struck me out. I'll read this. It's got obviously a question at the end. So I was struck by your thought experiment, Drones over Aleppo 2042. Terrorism in an age of AI, with its depiction of granular drones delivering humanitarian aid amidst the lawless liminal space of a sprawling refugee camp, while searching for a terrorist leader who taunts the West with atrocity deepfakes and who may in fact be an AI. Drawing on Virilio, is it inevitable that the invention of AI entails the AI incident, where AI escapes our control and turns on us, leading to Blitzkrieg and Cybertag?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I was trying to do in the book, and it goes back to what I was saying about necropolitics and protopia, is kind of get the reader to think that there isn't one future that I think is inevitable. There's multiple futures, and I think the key point of our time is the multiplication of futures. And so we've got to be open to the full range of possibilities. And I think one of the things I was trying to do with these short stories or scenarios was, contribute to that kind of process of saying, well, there's lots of different possibilities on the horizon. And that's the challenge, is to kind of be open to the range of possibilities. And I think these stories was, that was one of the things I was most concerned about in writing the book. I was like, yeah, including kind of fictional short stories in a supposedly academic book seemed a bit of a risky strategy, but I think it was kind of a useful kind of process to kind of develop for the book. But I think this idea of the accident is something I found really interesting, and it's central to what Paul Virilio is writing about throughout his work, whether it's the accident at a personal level through to the kind of technological accidents that he's kind of warning us about. And I think in many ways what his point is that in the 21st century, and this might be what distinguishes this century from the previous one, is that wars might change the future of civilization, but it might be a technological accident. And it could be AI, it could be something from biotechnology, but the possibility of the general accident, as he calls it, increases as we see the multiplication and acceleration of a range of emerging technologies. And I guess, the protopian, the kind of liberal optimist, will argue that we will be able to control all these potential risks that come from an increasingly technologically complex society. Yeah, and then basically that we're going to have laws and regulations that will control what Audrey Cronin calls open technological innovation. So basically the idea that one of the big challenges of the 21st century is this idea that individuals and small groups are going to be able to do increasingly sophisticated things with all the technology that they've got access to via AI tools and so on. And I think, this is one of the big kind of concerns of our time. Are we going to be able to control and manage all this innovation that occurs in the realm of emerging technologies? And I think one of the points I tried to make in the book is that, I'm not sure laws and regulation will manage the security implications of open technological innovation. And I think possibly there will be a lot of effort placed into using police and military force to control potential threats emerging from open technological innovation. And so much of politics will be about trying to shape emerging technology and manage the risks, because the technologies could transform what it means to be human, can transform the capacity of non-state actors. This question of, what will a terrorist group be able to do in 2049 in a time of technological innovation? And so you'll have, in what I call cyberpunk international politics, you'll have small groups like the kind of organization in films and anime like Ghost in the Shell that are trying to intervene in this kind of new technological landscape. And so these are ideas very much influenced by cyberpunk books and films, Ghost in the Shell in particular. And this idea that you're going to have highly trained groups operating across the planet to respond to emerging threats or to create increasingly innovative types of military event. So like the pager attacks from a couple of months back. And I think that rather than these wars of highly trained soldiers waging long wars like in Iraq, Afghanistan, you're going to have more highly trained groups of soldiers and police engaged in policing cyberpunk international politics or training and assisting soldiers who will be risking their lives in places like Ukraine. A point we've made already. But in terms of an AI accident that is inevitable and on the horizon, I'm not sure that an AI accident or a kind of catastrophic event is inevitable. But there's going to be unintended consequences. And I guess the interesting question is what type of accident or unintended consequence is on the horizon. And as I said earlier, the AI accident can be more like Mr. Bates and the post office than the Terminator. But I guess the interesting question I'm trying to think about is the types of use or misuse or accident that we're generally not thinking about. And thinking about what the kind of AI black swan might be is obviously it's incredibly difficult. But the example in the story from the book, I think is quite possible. And I was thinking about this recently in relation to Gaza, and I wrote a short piece in the conversation where I kind of explore this further. And I was thinking about, could you have a leader that has kind of read and studied military and political events and has experienced and led an organization, but becomes turned into an AI tool, basically? So, and you see this already, where AI is being used as a kind of educator, a source of guidance, as a kind of tool to help you make decisions. But could you have, if I'm a leader of a terrorist group and I think I'm going to be assassinated, could I create an AI tool that is going to help me guide the organization after my death? And that, I think, is what I was trying to get at in that short story, that you could have AI leaders in organizations that are being made increasingly vulnerable because you're losing all the leadership. And I guess that is one of the things I was trying to think about in that short story, that, how will AI tools be used to enhance organizations? And I don't go too far into talking about how it might assist the organization. It's more about the kind of creation of a figurehead that is a kind of AI generated figurehead, rather than someone who's giving guidance and shaping plans and decisions. But that's the kind of thing I wanted to get people to think about. And, the point of these short stories or scenarios, just to get people thinking. I think that's the whole point of the book, is really just to get people thinking about what might be on the horizon in a way that is open to a variety of possibilities, basically. It's kind of, the book is there to kind of provoke you to think about what could be on the horizon and hopefully come up with ideas that are much more creative than the ones that I came up with, basically.
No, that's really great, Mark. Just as you were saying there, I really like that aspect in that particular story where it was kind of ambiguous whether the AI was kind of its own leader of an organization or whether it was something created in the way that, people in entertainment are augmented by AI or even wholly creations of AI. Something that often comes to mind is, if a group using AI or some other cybernetic means wanted to do a kind of really destructive terrorist attack on the psyche of a population, would be to somehow hack into everyone's cloud and just delete all the family photos.
Yeah.
Because I don't know whether you've ever, I nearly lost thousands of family photos and it was quite distressing. So in a kind of a low-key way, that would be a way of discombobulating the population. Yeah,
exactly. And that would fit more with the kind of idea of unrestricted warfare that I discuss in the book. This book that came out from China on, I think it was in the late 90s, on the future of warfare, where, the basic point is the way we want to wage war in the 21st century is not going to be like the American experience of the 20th century. and it's going to be doing things which totally take you by surprise and are kind of about exploiting everyday technologies. Yeah, and this idea of kind of neuro warfare, yeah, and the idea that the Chinese are thinking of ways to exploit the possibilities of neuroscience and the brain, basically. And I think this would be an example of that. That there might, if there is a really serious war in the next 50 years, it's not going to necessarily use the kinds of tools that we've seen used in the last couple of decades. And it's going to be kind of psychological war. It's going to be neuro warfare. It's going to be doing things that we are just not expecting, and have a psychological impact. That's certainly the kind of view of unrestricted warfare. That, you don't want to destroy infrastructure and buildings like in the Second World War. You can kind of influence and harm people in a kind of very different way, in a kind of networked digital society.
Yeah, you want to keep the infrastructure intact. You want to take that over and harm the people.
Yeah. Because we live in very different ways to people in the Second World War. And the way we can be harmed could be so different for exactly the reasons you're talking about.
Well, let's hope that the 21st century doesn't play out in ways that the 20th century did. But thank you very much for your time, Mark. I really appreciate this. It's been a fascinating discussion, lots of food for thought. And again, I'd recommend Theorizing Future Conflict, War Out to 2049. I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Brilliant.
Thanks for your time today, Mark.
Well, thanks a lot, James, and have a good Christmas. I look forward to the next podcast with Ben Swibelson.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant.